Newberg is full of amazing history, whether you realize it or not. From a past president who lived here, early pioneers like Ewing Young and Jesse Edwards, and their early Quaker influences, there are so many important stories and people and lessons to learn about that it can be easily lost in old newspapers and archives if not actively and properly preserved. And that's what the Newberg Area Historical Society, or NAHS, is all about. Their mission is to preserve, present, and promote the history of Newberg and the surrounding areas. Joining me today is Britta Mansfield, a board member of NAHS and the author of the book Newberg, Past and Present. We'll be talking about the importance of knowing our history, ways to make history fun and engaging, what makes Newberg's history special, a bit about Britta's book, and some stories and facts that you probably didn't know. Hi, I'm Daniel Roberts, host of the Giving Town podcast, where we share stories about the people and organizations that make this town so great. This podcast is brought to you by my real estate team, the Joyful Roberts Group, where we help your family make the right move. We love serving this town and our amazing clients and would be happy to help you with buying or selling a home anywhere around the Newberg area. So if you're interested, you can learn more about us at thejoyfulrobertsgroup.com. And with that, I appreciate you guys so much for every episode that you listen to, and I'm glad you're here. I hope you get something out of this. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Britta about the Newberg Area Historical Society. Britta, thank you so much for joining me on the Giving Town podcast today. It's great having you here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited.
So you've been on the Newberg Area Historical Society board for about 6 years now, right?
Yeah, if not a little bit more. Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And there's quite a bit of that's happened in that time. And obviously there's a lot of things that have happened in the past that it's funny, as you live, everything becomes the past. I don't want to get into all that, but what the first thing I wanted to start out with, before I make too many puns about time in the past, I did rein myself in. There's a reason that you're passionate about history. And I'm curious, why do you think it's so important to understand our history? And maybe you can go from both a local level and also just in general understanding history. Like, why do you think it's important for all of us to understand? And then what drives you specifically towards that?
Yeah, I think I'll flip that and start with why I really like history. I never really thought much of it growing up. And then I had a really fantastic 8th grade history teacher. I always loved school. I was a really nerdy kid. I'm still pretty nerdy. But never thought anything of history. You know, science and music were the things that I really loved. And then I had this amazing teacher when I was 14 that just brought history to life. Here in Oregon, 8th grade was all American history. And so we were learning about the American Revolution and how that happened, why that happened, and then kind of brought history at a really high level up through the modern day. And that was just such an enriching class. It was, the teacher was so passionate. I then became so passionate and kind of from then on thought, yes, I want to work with history in some capacity. I initially thought I wanted to teach, but I don't do that now. And I'm thankful that I don't, at least at this phase of life. But that's what really got me interested in it. And so I think that passion for America, that sounds like so cheesy and so like overly patriotic, but I really think America's history is so cool and so unique in the way that the U.S. government was formed and how it operates. That just fascinates me. So that's really what drove me to study it at a larger level. The more I studied it, and especially in college, and especially stepping into the world of public history, that is working with like museums and archives and really connecting the public to history, not just studying it in an academic sense, but looking at it through an everyday lens of how do we interact with this on a daily basis. That, I think, helped that passion just grow and helped me realize that understanding your history, like, it helps you understand why communities operate the way that they do today. It helps you see where we came from. And it can be a great like community builder. And I think especially in a place like Newberg or anywhere on the West Coast, and frankly, anywhere in America, understanding our history should give people, I think, a place of belonging because we're all a part of that history and we're making that every single day just by existing in this space. We're contributing to its culture and we're shaping the future, even on the small level of I only operate with, my few families in my community and I'm pretty insular and I raised my family. I go and do my job and that's that. But that's a piece of what culture is today and you're contributing to that. So understanding how your story fits into this broader story can really give people a sense of place and help them have a sense of belonging. I think that's really cool, especially when looking at local history. And I think Newberg's history really shines there because it is so recent. It wasn't settled by non-native people until like the late 1800s. And all of them were coming here from somewhere else with the goal of establishing kind of a new life here. And people still do that today. And I think that's really cool. So I think everybody that does that, anybody that moves here, anybody that participates in this community is a part of that bigger story. And I love that.
Yeah, it's cool that you had such a positive experience with history, because I think there's a lot of memes and a lot of jokes made about history. Like the only purpose of learning history is so that you can teach it later. And I think many people have a very dry and honestly kind of boring experience with history, which is sad, because when you experience it in a way that is engaging and exciting and it's not just a textbook about facts and it's actually, hey, here's the relatable things about this. I think there's a lot, I think it can be fun if done properly. Yeah. And anyway, so I'm wondering, just as I'm saying that, I'm wondering, like, what does it take? This is a question I didn't ask, but I'm curious what you think. Like, what does it take for a community to get excited about its history, rather than just like, oh yeah, there's a historical society, they see it with the same passion they see like newspaper archives, like only those nerdy historians will go and dig them up. But I feel like there's a way to engage a community and make them excited and present history in a way. So can you share your thoughts on that? Yeah, that's a very important question. And I think that's a question I ask myself a lot. And I think my colleagues ask that a lot, because that's what, as somebody who works in the field of public history, that's our goal, is to get people excited about it. And so I think there's two things that come to mind right off the bat. One is it's in how you present it, right? Like history, you can present it in a really boring way. And unfortunately, a lot of people do. And I personally think that's why a lot of people don't like history. I think that's why I didn't love it until I had somebody present it in a really engaging way. I think that's changing. I think people realize that, and they're coming up with more creative and engaging ways to present the past. So I think that's fantastic. But I think that's a big piece. And then I think the other piece is just a general awareness. You don't necessarily come to Newberg and think, oh, this is such a historic town. Like, it's a town on the west coast of the U.S. We're like so new. How can we have a deep, rich history? But there is really cool history here. And so it's making sure that we're raising awareness through an engaging storytelling method, or whatever that looks like. And getting people to engage looks different for everybody, because some people are going to engage with the textbook really well, and some people want a really hands-on living history experience. Some people want just signs on buildings that acknowledge, hey, this place is historic. So it's really broad and it's really personalized, but I think being creative is a big piece of it. Yeah. Speaking of which, I mean, specifically for Newberg, because that's kind of what this podcast is about. What are some, the question I was going to ask is, the word was significant historical events, but I think another word, there's significant events, but there's also events that are maybe not considered significant from a historical perspective, but that are exciting and engaging, and that, a movie could probably be made of like, hey, this thing happened and no one really knows, because doesn't change the course of history necessarily, but it's like just a really fascinating and engaging thing. So what are some of those stories? Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know a ton of the like funny, quirky stories about Newberg. I think I used to work at the Hooverman Thorne House here in town, and so would tell a lot of just like oral histories about the town. And something that people always thought was kind of interesting and different was the fact that George Fox University didn't actually start at its current location. If you're familiar with Newberg, it started where the large Friends Church is, the brick Friends Church on, what is that, Edwards Street? On College, right? It's College, yeah, exactly. That's where the university started, where the college started. And there were two original buildings, and they were moved across town to the current campus location on logs with horses pulling them, which is just kind of weird. You don't think about... I didn't know that. That's funny. Right. We don't think about how buildings were moved in the past, because we've seen buildings move today. There's a building up on blocks that's being moved in downtown Newberg right now. So we see how that happens in the modern day, but you don't think, oh, wait, people could do that
over 100 years ago. And what did that look like? And so you tell them that, yeah, it was moved across town on logs, and people would be like, what? That's so weird. How did that work? And you have to like explain.
But how did it pass inspection and qualify for financing? Yeah.
Right, exactly.
That's my real estate hat that I can't take off.
So that's a really just like quirky story. I think something else that's fun, Newberg was a dry town until 1966. But there was a building, I want to say it was a George Fox campus building, but I could be totally wrong about that. And I don't remember when it was built, but it was built during the time when you couldn't have alcohol here in Newberg. And then at some point after that ban was lifted, they had to open up the walls to do some extra construction or some remodeling or something like that. And they found an empty whiskey bottle in the wall of this building. So it was like, yeah, Newberg was a dry town, but like, was it really? Like, I don't know that we have the whole picture there.
Kind of like how George Fox is a dry campus. And
yeah.
No one drinks ever.
Nobody.
Well, that's really interesting. You even mentioned the fact that Newberg was a dry town. One of the things that kind of got me excited, maybe I can't quite say I'm excited about history in the way that some other people are, but the story of Ewing Young.
Yeah.
And Doug Root he actually shared on this podcast too, but I think it was at a Chamber of Commerce event, he first shared the story of Ewing Young and how he was actually instrumental in the formation of Oregon. His property there's Ewing Young Distillery, there's Ewing Young School, there's Ewing Young Park, but Ewing Young lived to just outside of Newberg, and without him, Oregon could have stayed under British control and might not have become part of America, which is huge. And that happened here. And the story about how he started the prohibition of alcohol so that he could do his scheme of distilling and get paid by the British. So is that part of why Newberg was a dry town until 1966, or is that...
It might be a piece of it, but I've always heard the separate story of it was the Quaker aspect of Newberg. Yeah. So Newberg was, when it was finally settled by non-native people, again, in like the late 1880s, it was largely Quakers that were coming out kind of from Iowa and that general area. And Quakers typically don't drink, or at least they didn't then. I'm not personally Quaker, but I know there's a lot of Quakers in Newberg. So talk to a Quaker if you know when to see what their current stance on alcohol is. But at least then it was that you didn't consume any alcohol. Yeah. And it was actually Jesse Edwards, who's kind of considered one of the Quaker fathers of Newberg. Okay. He bought basically the whole south side of town. So over by the Hoover Minthorn House, over where the Friends Church is, he owned all of that property. He bought like 184 acres of land in 1880. Spent his first winter in the Willamette Valley, actually in Dayton, and then came up in the spring of 1881 to build his first home here. He had the whole portion of land that he purchased, surveyed and platted, and then he sold it to various people. He donated some to churches and schools, and then he sold it to individuals who wanted to farm it or, build homes or do whatever they wanted. And he put clauses in the deeds of those properties that if alcohol was found on the property, ownership would revert to the previous owner. Wow. So that's where I've heard a lot of the ban stemming from. And I've actually talked to people who had Jesse Edwards deeds well after the 1966 lift of the alcohol ban. And there were people that were still hesitant to have alcohol on their property. Oh, interesting. Even because of those deeds. And I've been told that wouldn't be, I don't think that would have any legal bearing today. But there were some people that well after 1966 were still concerned about it because it was in these property deeds and so tied into the Quaker tradition that has been here in Newberg. What an interesting legal question. If someone was like, well, let's test that out, that would be a fun court case. I can see why people wouldn't want to put it to the test. Yeah. Yeah, that'd be another fun way for Newberg to make the news. So what is your personal favorite story about Newberg? I think it's twofold, and they're big picture stories more than individual stories. I really came to appreciate Herbert Hoover's story. That is still a tongue twister. I think it's really cool to see how the little small community of Newberg, I think, frankly, impacted the U.S. and to an extent the whole world. I think a lot of Herbert Hoover's values, and especially his charitable side, that's what he was much more successful in, was running charities than actually running a nation. Yeah. But he did tons of charitable work and relief work during both the world wars over in Europe. And I think his heart for that really came from his Quaker upbringing that he got here in Newberg and in Salem. And so it's really neat to look at the big picture of, oh, wow, somebody's childhood does really impact their adult life. And when you fall into a role like Herbert Hoover did, you're impacting millions of lives. You're saving millions of lives.
Yeah.
So I think that connection to national history is really fascinating.
And I want to actually ask on the story of Herbert Hoover, because I know a lot of people drive by the Hoover Minthorn House Museum. And I think a lot of people are like, oh yeah, maybe something with Herbert Hoover in Newberg, but don't really know anything.
Yeah.
And I know a little bit. I know that he lived here, but what's the story and connection of Herbert Hoover? And I can't even remember when he was, obviously during World Wars, but like, what's the story and the connection in Newberg, and kind of play that out a little bit, like how that affected him and what did he go on to do?
Yeah, that's a great
short
question.
History lesson of Herbert Hoover and his childhood.
Short history lesson. Okay, I'll keep this as short as I can. And it's been years since I've formally given this tour, so
good luck.
It'll be a little rough. But he was born in Iowa in the 1870s, and both of his parents died when he was very young. So he was then adopted by his uncle Henry John or John Henry Minthorn and his wife Laura. John and Laura moved all over the country, but they'd been living in Iowa right when Herbert Hoover was born, so they'd known him as a small child. And they actually had a son of their own. They were living in Oregon, and their son passed away, I think, in a farming accident. I could be wrong about that, but they had 3 daughters and a son, and their son had passed away. So by the time they came to Newberg, they knew that Herbert Hoover was orphaned. They kind of knew they could use another set of hands to help out with chores. I think John kind of liked Herbert Hoover. That's just my own assessment. John was a really gruff guy, but he maybe saved Herbert Hoover's life when he was a baby. He had a really bad case of croup, I think, and John was a doctor, so he was able to, I think he actually resuscitated Hoover is what I'd read in a couple places. So I think he kind of had a connection to him and asked for him to be sent out to Oregon and live with him. So when Hoover was 11, yes, right around there, he came out to live the rest of his childhood in Oregon.
So this is 1880s, so Newberg is in its infancy still.
In its infancy, yeah. It was the 1884, I think, is when Hoover came out here. He was one of the first students at Friends Pacific Academy, which eventually became George Fox University. That's where both his aunt and uncle taught. And he lived for 3 years here in Newberg, 3 years down in Salem, and then went on to Stanford and the rest of his life. But, those were formational years. Your teen years are really important. You kind of become at least a piece of who you will be as an adult in your teen years. And he spent those in a small Quaker town with a unique but still intensely Quaker aunt and uncle. And I think they instilled some really good values in him. I don't think they had a perfect relationship, but he did get some really important life skills and life values that then I think he carried with him into his relief work that he did all throughout Europe. He did some relief work here in the U.S. after there was a large flood on the Mississippi right before the 1928 election, which was kind of his American claim to fame. And then he was elected in 1928 to the presidency. And then you had the Depression, and that was just really unfortunate. But he went on to do more charitable work after he was president.
What was his role before he was president?
He had a geology degree, and he was a mining engineer. Okay. Yeah. So nothing that you would think would be related to being a president.
So what was his really goal? Like you mentioned his relief, in Europe and with the Mississippi River. Yeah. I don't know anything about that. So.
No, that's okay. So during the First World War, he was living in London. His job had taken him to London. He'd gotten connected to some mines in Australia and I think some Chinese companies. He was a very international guy. He was working with so many different companies just because he was a mining engineer and managing mines kind of all over the world. One of the companies he worked with was based in London, so he was there with his wife and kids living and saw the war break out. And twofold really started with there were Americans that were getting stranded in London because there was a war going on and it became suddenly very difficult to get passage back to America. So Hoover helped organize that. I actually think he helped fund people's passage back to the U.S.
Oh, wow.
Just out of his own pocket, which is pretty incredible. And then the country of Belgium in particular was having a really tough time getting food to its citizens. They imported a lot of food and their food sources were essentially cut off during the war. But Hoover was able to organize a lot of food from the U.S. and get it through, not customs, but get it through all of the international roadblocks of importing food that happened during a war, and was able to get food into the hands of Belgian citizens and basically prevent a nationwide famine.
Wow.
Yeah. And then he came back to the U.S. and he actually became the Secretary of Commerce, I think.
Okay.
He had a couple different like cabinet level roles in the U.S. government. One of them would being the Secretary of Commerce. And then again, using these great organizational skills. That's really what got food to the Belgians. Was he was an amazing organizer and was able to work through bureaucracies and just get things organized. And he kind of did the same thing in Mississippi after a major flood. I don't know all of the details of that situation, but I know a lot more Americans saw that, and that's what familiarized people with him, at least in the U.S.
Yeah. Oh, that is fascinating. And I know this isn't a Herbert Hoover podcast episode, but it is interesting to hear. Just one example. And what's fascinating to me is you never know what small actions you take are going to affect history. And, it's funny, like the weirdest things sometimes make me feel emotional. I'm like, oh my gosh, so powerful. But, just the fact of like, you're resuscitating a baby.
Yeah.
That can go on to like be the next president of the United States.
Right.
And it's just cool. And it makes, I think it's like the whole point of this podcast is sharing the stories about the great things that happen in Newberg and really to inspire people, because you never know what small thing you can do that's going to impact history forever.
Yeah.
And something as small as like, paying for the groceries for the person in front of you, or even like a smile for someone who's having a terrible day, who then rather than going home and yelling at their kids, is able to treat them well and help them through just the ripple effect. That's why I do this. And that's why I think that's, I want to like these stories that people say, that's just a small thing. Like, why does it matter? It's like, well, you just never know. It's important to just keep that in mind of always look to do the small little things, because you never know when you could impact history.
Exactly. So, I don't think John Minthorn thought he was raising a future president when he decided to take in his nephew. He just took in his nephew because it seemed like the right thing to do in the moment.
Yeah.
So I think that's a good, always do it seems like the right thing in the moment. It's a good rule of thumb.
So what's the history of the Newberg Area Historical Society? Like how does it actually get started?
Yeah. We've had a historical society in this town on a couple different times throughout history. I don't know the details of all of them. Apparently there was in the 80s or 90s, there was a couple that kind of had a small historical society going. Actually, I guess I should jump back. There was a group, I can't remember their name. It's totally escaping me right now, but there was a historical society type group that was really involved with Hoover Minthorn House when it first opened. So it opened in 1955. One of Hoover's childhood friends actually opened it, but that's a story for another time. But there was a group of people that were interested in all sorts of Newberg history type things that were involved with keeping the museum going and publicizing it. And then,
by the way, I keep cutting you off. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay.
So the museum, which is on 2nd Street and River, right?
2nd and River. Yep.
Okay. Now I know a lot of people have driven by there. What might someone find in there before I forget to ask the question?
Yeah.
Because I'm like, oh, I should go there sometime, and I haven't yet, which is kind of embarrassing, but I haven't. And I know probably at least half the town hasn't.
Yeah, you're probably right.
Why should someone go and visit that?
That's a great question. I think for all of the reasons that I kind of mentioned at the beginning of the podcast about why history is important and giving you a sense of place and understanding like where we came from, it's a great way to go and actually see that. I think historic house museums are really cool because they let you step into the past in a sense. They have the house decorated, the way a house would have been, or at least very close to the way a house would have been decorated in the 1880s. And it's one thing to read about, here's what life was like in the 1880s. And it's another to really step into that and stand in the kitchen of a house that was built in 1881 and realize, wait, there's no sink. There's no refrigerator. Like there's not even a pantry necessarily to like store food. How did life work? And it just helps you see things in a totally different way. It's a really immersive experience. So I think that's, for me, that's why anybody should go to any historic house museum.
Okay. And then I'm guessing you can learn about Hoover and all the things that he did.
Yes, learn about all the other Hoover and Newberg things there too. Yeah.
Okay, and impress your friends, I'm sure, with some cool, well, maybe actually. It's like, hey, don't take for granted what's right under your nose.
Exactly.
Okay, so you were talking about a group, a historical society. You kind of got that started back 60 years ago or so.
Something like that. And then I don't really know what happened. And I've heard that there was a couple that kind of had a small historical society in the, I want to say 80s or 90s. I could be totally wrong about that though. The most recent version of the historical society, I'd say, was started by George and Lucy Edmonston. I don't know if you've met George. I think
I met George. I think he moved away and came back, but anyway, I know who he is.
But so he was really integral in getting like this current version of the society started. And I say current version kind of loosely because it's really morphed over the last few years. It was because
he wrote a book called The Grubby End.
He did,
right?
yes.
Okay.
Yeah, he had a newspaper column that all of the stories in his book were in the Newberg Graphic. It's a fun historic column. They're a great read if you want fun history. Like, would highly recommend reading that.
Okay.
Anyway, he started this group. At some point, it became involved with the Newberg Downtown Coalition. And when I came on board, I think my first interaction with the Historical Society here in Newberg was probably in 2016. And it was under the umbrella of the Newberg Downtown Coalition. I came on the board in 2018, and by that point, the Downtown Coalition was shifting a lot, and the Historical Society was, at least we thought, kind of growing, and we realized, okay, we probably shouldn't be under an umbrella organization. We should be our own organization. So myself and Rachel Thomas, who at the time was the archivist at George Fox University, we were both on the board. There were a couple other board members whose names are escaping me right now. But we decided that we should make it its own nonprofit. So we went through all of the paperwork of setting up our own 501c3 and getting that established. And that happened around sometime between 2018 and 2020. I don't remember the whole timeline of that happening. So we've been our own organization for roughly 5 or 6 years, which has been great for us, I think. That's kind of the short history of the organization. I'm happy to answer any questions about that. But
what specific things do you guys do to preserve, and what is it? Preserve, protect, promote?
Preserve, present, and promote the history of Newberg and the surrounding areas.
Preserve,
That's
present,
our mission.
Okay. So what specific things do you do to do that?
That's really shifted recently. When I started, a big piece of what we did was public monthly lectures, and those were always related to Newberg history. We'd have people from St. Paul come in. We tried to get a Dundee connection, so really focusing on super local history. And then COVID happened, and that was really hard for a lot of heritage and just arts and culture organizations in general. So since then, we haven't really restarted our public lectures. We've tried to, but attendance was always just really low. And it's a ton of work, actually, to get a regular lecture series going. I've worked towards it with another organization, and it's just a lot of work. And in today's society, I don't think you ever really know how many people are really going to show up or what's going to be interesting. It's really hit or miss what topic is going to be engaging or not. So that used to be our big presentation and promotion. And then preservation, we have a very small physical collection that we actually currently store at the Hoover Minthorn House. But on top of that, we used to have a very active blog where we were trying to collect stories and share them online. And we're really shifting now. We're a very small organization currently. And so we're trying to stay alive as much as we can. And we'd love to see, our blog filled out with more actual histories of the area. I'd love to see an oral history project happen. I just want to make sure that the human stories of Newberg are not lost, and you don't need a lot of physical space to preserve those. They can be preserved in written format or in an oral history recording and saved online somewhere, saved on a computer. You don't need a lot of space to do that. So that's where I see us going right now for preservation. Presentation, we've worked over the last few years to do some signage programs throughout downtown. I think we have 5 or 6 signs currently up in the downtown part of Newberg explaining historic buildings throughout the town. And we actually just had 3 more printed. So we wrapped up our second round of signage. So those will be hopefully installed by building owners shortly. So that's another form of presentation. And then promotion, I don't think we're promoting right now as much as we have in the past, but that's, just marketing, just making people aware that, hey, there's history here.
Do you guys have like a newsletter you send out?
We used to. We are moving towards that, but it's kind of just me and one other individual that are writing for it, and we're doing a ton of other things on top of that. So we'd love to. We've done a couple articles with Newsberg, and that was our goal, was to kind of have regular history installments in Newsberg. So that's what we're moving towards.
Okay.
It's just been a really busy season.
Yeah. Well, I was going to ask the connection with Newsberg, because I know they already have a following, and if someone's wanted to learn more specifically about just the historic side, what I was wondering though with that is if people, like if there could be guest submissions, like for the people who've been here for a long time, submit things that you guys review and make sure that they're, good. And then that way you're not having to do the work of.
I'd love to see that. I think that's a fantastic idea.
Okay.
Yeah. When we've talked about that, it's kind of just launching that program and, when do we hit the go button?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I wonder if you guys were saying, hey, this is something that we want to do, whether it's on Newsberg or the Newberg Graphic, I feel like that would be worthy enough to have a whole article about like, hey, we're starting this program, and maybe even listening to this podcast, people can reach out to you guys and say, hey, I've got stories. I'd love to share them.
That'd be great. We are happy to take stories if people want to share them.
Okay.
Yeah.
Then if you're listening to this, you can reach out to Newberg Area Historical Society. What's your guys' email, by the way?
newberghistory@gmail.com.
Newberg History. Oh, that's easy. newberghistory@gmail.com. I'll have that in the show notes too. And I'm just going to write a note before I forget, because sometimes I don't remember everything.
Our website has a contact form too that goes right to that email. So I think it's newberghistory.com, and you can go to the contact us section and submit notes there.
Okay. Well, cool. Yeah. There's so many stories that are, for people who've lived here for decades, and then they hear things from their grandparents, I think those are the kind of things. So yeah, that'd be cool. One of the other things you mentioned this earlier is like buildings and landmarks that people might not even be aware of. So I think Chapters building, people know, I think that was like one of the first buildings, right? And it was like a grain store. What are some other things though that people might not be aware of, that have significant like landmarks or history or things like that?
Yeah. I think Rogers Landing is a big one. Especially so I volunteer with the Newberg Area Historical Society. I work with another heritage-based organization. It's called the Willamette Falls and Landings Heritage Area Coalition. It's really a conversation for another time, but we have the word landings in our name because we focus on the histories largely of the Willamette River. And it's not just the river that's important and the communities on either side of it, but it's the river landings that enabled a space to be utilized. So Rogers Landing is a space where historically people have landed as they've traveled on the river. And I think we know that. I always forget Rogers' first name. It's totally just gone from my brain right now. It's not George, but I want to say George. But whoever Rogers Landing Fred. Is named after. Yes, not Fred.
Not Rick.
He used it as a landing. Jesse Edwards landed there.
Okay.
And I think even native populations probably used it as a landing. It's got a natural space where the river comes up, and it makes it easy to pull yourself or boats or fish out of the water. So it's been a historic landing spot for years. So I think that's just important to recognize. It's not just a funny place to go put your boat in, and it's not just a county park. It's it's actually really significant to why Newberg developed the way that it did. I think the other historic piece of Newberg as far as buildings are concerned that I really like is the neighborhood that's in our downtown core. I think that is really unique because there are buildings from all different eras. There are still some 1880s buildings throughout the area, and you can find buildings from pretty much every decade from the 1880s through the current day. And it's really fun to look at that and kind of see how Newberg developed and put a timeline together of when each pocket was developed or redeveloped and what that looked like. And just looking at the different styles of architecture in the residential areas, I think is really interesting. Especially, I live over on the south side of Newberg, and looking at the diverse architecture is really fun. My husband and I talk about that all the time as we walk. There's some great mid-century pieces that are just like, in all of their wonderful 1950s glory. I love mid-century architecture, so that's my favorite. But there's some great like old craftsman houses. There's some Dutch colonial houses. There's really new, modern, boxy, unique buildings. And it's just extremely diverse. And I think that's so cool to have in one neighborhood.
Man, if only there was like a book that compared like Newberg, like the past and the present and showed pictures of all
Well,
these.
funny you should say that. There is a book.
Yeah, so your book, Newberg Past and Present, which basically does that, right? So you take old photos. How did that book start? Did you go out saying, "Oh, I want to write a book about this," or was it like a project that turned into a book? Like, what was that?
Yeah, I think
evolution.
Kind of always wanted to write a book. Since formally studying history, that was always a goal to be published, and I always thought it would be published in a more academic sense. I thought I'd go into grad school and have a dissertation published, and that would be that. So that's what I thought was going to happen.
Never too late.
Never too late. Exactly. I'm not discounting that. It very well may happen in the future, but it's not in the cards for today. So in 2021, the publisher, Arcadia Publishing, they approached the Newberg Area Historical Society because they were launching this new Past and Present series, which is funny to call it a new series because it's a history book. But they've done these historic picture books of various communities across the U.S. There's one about Newberg that is it's in the coffee shops. I'm sure a lot of people have seen it. It's got all the sepia toned photos and talks very briefly just about Newberg in general. This new series that they launched is specifically comparing old photos to historic photos and looking at how things have kind of changed over time. And they were doing these, again, for communities across the U.S. So they actually approached the Newberg Area Historical Society and asked us as a group if we'd like to work on this new book for them. I was on the board at the time and had recently gotten engaged. One of our other board members was about to have another child, and life just seemed like way too crazy as a board for the group to take that on. But I said, what the heck? I'll do it. I want to write a book. Let's start somewhere. It's not the dissertation I thought I'd publish, but let's start somewhere and get used to this process. So I said that I would just write it myself, which was exciting at the time. And it was a fun decision. And then, I got married very quickly, had a child, was very sick for a lot of that pregnancy. It was kind of a mess of a first year of marriage in a really good way.
Sounds actually familiar other than writing a book.
It was a very busy time. So, I think it took about 2 years to write the whole book. And I thought I was going to have so much time. I just started a part-time job. And so I thought this will be great. This will pair really well with a part-time job. And I ended up writing. I thought my initial plan when I found out I was having our first child, I thought, oh, well, I'll just write it when I'm on maternity leave and not doing my regular job. Well, that didn't pan out. Any of you that are listening and have kids know that when you take leave for having a child, you need to take care of yourself and that new child, and you don't have time to write a book. So I ended up writing it in a pretty short period of time when my first child was 6 months old. And I was like, okay, wait, this deadline is rapidly approaching. I need to actually get on this. So it was kind of a scramble to write, but it was a fun project. And that's how it came to be.
So what is the book in a nutshell? What can people expect from getting it?
Yeah, I think the best thing is it's a visual walk through different facets of Newberg history. I'm totally blanking on all of the different chapters, but I think there's 4 or 5 separate chapters looking at different types of building. There's a section on churches, there's a section on schools, on businesses, and on just generally around town photos. So it shows kind of how things progressed, starting as early as, I think it has the Hoover Minthorn House in it. So that's the oldest building still standing in Newberg. So built in 1881. And then it was really based on...
So it's not Chapters?
Chapters is the oldest commercial building still standing, but not the oldest residential building. Mm-hmm. Okay. Chapters is also in it in the business section. Okay. But it doesn't follow a timeline. It really follows those categories that I just mentioned and looks at how those categories kind of changed over time. I was really surprised going through it how many buildings are still there. There's not many. I mean, I'd encourage you to flip through the book if you ever get a chance to. There's not many historic photos that don't have a matching modern photo where the building is not there, I should say. There's 1 or 2. There's one church on the corner of Edwards and 2nd that is no longer there. That's one that sticks out. There's a couple churches actually that aren't there, but there's still buildings in their space. So it's still shows that Newberg is a very lived in and used space, which is really cool. Yeah. But yeah, it's a visual walk through different categories of Newberg life, if you will.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Was there anything that surprised you from, obviously the life life happened, but for like what you expected the book to be and like what you found, were there any specific things that were like, oh wow, this was like, I had no idea, or this was really surprising, or just...
I was surprised at how much research it actually took. Like there's not a lot of words in it. There's every page is 2 pictures and you have one caption that explains both pictures. So it wasn't a ton of writing. I really like to write, and it wasn't a lot of writing. So that was surprising. But even with that, there was so much research that went into finding out what really was this building and discovering, wow, there's actually some ambiguity about what some of these buildings were. So just that level of, I didn't realize how much I was going to have to dig to find the stories of each of these buildings.
Do you know how many buildings was it, or like roughly, do you know?
Oh, I think it's close to 100, I want to say.
Oh, wow.
I could be wrong about that.
That is a lot of research.
It was, yeah. And I mean, like some of them, right? Like I've known the history of chapters. I knew the history of the Hoover Minthorn House. I used a lot of George Fox pictures because that's history that I had already studied and knew a lot about. But a lot of the buildings on First Street, there's a handful that were hard to piece together. And the First Street was really fun to work with, even though it was a lot of work. There were some buildings that like stories just weren't lining up. I was using a couple different sources, and it was like, I have no idea what this actually was. And it took like looking at the pattern of brick and literally just walking downtown with a historic photo and saying, where do I see that brick pattern? Which was actually really fun.
Yeah, that'd be like a fun puzzle. Like,
yeah,
if you had time, that's kind of the whole thing. I wonder if you could also partner with like George Fox. Do they still have a history degree at George Fox?
They do, yeah.
Okay, that might be a like fun like class project, like taking on like social media or getting involved, because like those are the things that you don't have time for. But like having a fun like, hey, and some people have done that. I think like, hey, where's this picture from? And then there's like a raffle prize or something from. Like those ideas are easy, but then actually doing it consistently is the hard part.
Yeah. We've done it. We've worked with some Fox students. We've had some Fox interns manage the Historical Society's Facebook page and Instagram at various points. And Fox students are fun to work with. George Fox actually did a really cool project a few years ago called the Mapping Our History Project.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know if you've interviewed them about that, but that was a fantastic project. And that helped me a ton with my book. That was a great starting point, at least for research. And seeing, okay, what sources did they use? What did they find out? And then I went out and found additional sources and compared things. So that was a super helpful project and really fun if you're curious about the history of the downtown. They have way more buildings mapped out than my book does. So the Mapping Our History project from George Fox is a great thing to check out sometime. Okay.
Yeah, I don't know if... Well, we can figure out who I would have to talk to because the students probably aren't there.
No, but the professors that led it are still there.
That's true. As far as the organization itself, what is your, like as the board, or maybe you, like, what is the vision for the future?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I don't know how the
future of the past.
The future of the past, exactly. I don't know that I have a super strong long-term vision. I think I'd just love to see it still be here. And I'd love to see it ultimately meet the community's need. And that's hard when a community doesn't really know that it's here. How does it know that it needs this? That's hard. But I think the future is doing podcasts like this and getting out into the community so people are aware of us. I want to see a future where people know that we exist and engage with our history pretty regularly. And I think that means morphine. Myself and one of my other board members have talked about starting a book club with the library. I think partnering with organizations, partnering with the city, making sure the Historic Preservation Commission is aware of our work, making sure even city council is aware of our work to an extent, and then partnering with other groups like the library or the cultural center, or wherever else we can find those partnerships to raise awareness and get people engaged with history. I'd love to see a book club launch. I think that could be a really practical way to get people together to talk and learn about Newberg history without it having to be like just a sit down lecture. That doesn't really work for everybody.
What does the board and organization look like right now?
I think we technically have 3 people on our board. Okay. 2 of us are pretty active and meet somewhat regularly. We'd love to see that grow. And I think the more active board members we have, the more we can do. So if you're interested in making history happen, let me know and we can talk about joining our board.
Yeah. So if there's people listening who have a vested interest in preserving history, newberghistory@gmail.com. Reach out.
Yep.
Okay. No, that's glad. And I'm glad that you're here. We can get the word out because I imagine there are a lot of people who would be interested in some capacity, but I think, on my end, I'm kind of in a similar position with the Young Professionals group.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, you should come to.
I know. I really need to.
Not like you don't have like a family and stuff, but like when it's just, oh my gosh, like we have 2 people or 3 people, it's really hard to get anything done.
Yes.
Whereas like you have like a couple extra people who can share the load, and now it's easier to get the word out and expand.
Yes.
So
the more people you have, the less work there actually is for any one person to do.
Yeah. It's like a saying, like many hands make light the work or something.
There you go.
So other than that, like what are other ways that people can get involved that you guys are looking for right now?
I think that's engaging with us when you see us publicly is a big one. So keep your eyes peeled for a book club, read our articles as they come out in Newsberg. And then, wow, I have like serious mom brain happening right now. Sharing your history. I think we mentioned that earlier, but if you have stories that, even if you're not sure if they're worth sharing, but you just want to share them, like send them our way. We're happy to read your email. We'll respond. We'll say thank you. And if it's, historically accurate and you want it published, we can turn it into a blog post. So share your history with us. I think that's huge.
Yeah. All right, Britta, last question is, and I ask this to everyone, and I almost forgot to ask it, but what gives you hope for the future of Newberg?
Oh, man, that's a really good question. I think, what gives me hope? I think, okay, this is like so dorky, but you see it on the signs as you drive into town that Newberg is a great place to grow. That is so what I have experienced here, what my husband and my family are experiencing here. I think what gives me hope is that it is a great place to grow. Newberg is a great community. There are so many people that are invested in making sure that Newberg stays a great community and that are engaged with their community on a whole host of different levels. People are super engaged in nonprofits. People are engaged in local government. People are engaged with their churches and with their neighbors. And just seeing that level of engagement and the fact that people are really nice here. I talk about that with my husband all the time. We go to the grocery store and we always run into people we know. And even the people that we don't know are happy to say hello to you or smile at your kid. And they're just nice. And I think that's really hopeful, is that Newberg has this like small town feel, even though it's not really a small town anymore, but people seem to like being here and they like to be around the other people that are here. And I think that gives me hope that no, we can just be nice humans to each other, and let's perpetuate that. So that's kind of a weird answer, but
well, that's exactly what I think. So
yeah,
I think it's a great answer.
Yeah, I think that's why I stay here. That's why I care about this community, and that is what I think is going to carry it into the future. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Britta. Appreciate you taking the time to be here and talk on the podcast. Look forward to seeing what happens with the Newberg Area Historical Society as you guys continue to grow and flourish, and see what's next.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for tuning in to the Giving Town podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider sharing it with a friend who you think might benefit from hearing it. While more and more people are continuing to hear about this podcast, I still need your help to spread the message about all the people and organizations that make Newberg so great. Well, thanks for tuning in, and I'll catch you in the next episode.